our today's speaker, Professor Brian Brayboy. Brian Brayboy is Special Advisor to the President on American Indian Affairs and President's Professor and Borderlands Professor of Indigenous Education and Justice in the School of Social Transformation at Arizona State University. He is also the Director of the Center for Indian Education at ASU. He earned his master's degree and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. His research focuses on race and justice issues, the experiences of indigenous students, staff, and faculty in institutions of higher education. He writes about indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous research methodologies. His work, his material is core material in many of the courses that we teach at the Graduate School of Education. He has authored numerous publications and is most recently the lead author of a book, Post-Secondary Education for American Indian and Alaska Natives, Higher Education for Nation Building and Self-Determination. We'll learn from him. We'll learn pathways, the difficult roadblocks, and the ways in which students resist and change structures to access higher education. We learn from him ways to understand critical race theory and advance the concept of tribal crit. We also know from his work the importance of recognizing sovereignty and self-determination of Native American students and Native people. The title of today's talk, you see it here, but I love to read it too, Education, Ethnic Studies, and Justice in Arizona. Please join me in welcoming Professor Brian Brayboy.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. I'm always a little bit humbled when someone like Professor Baquedano Lopez introduces me with such warm things. I always wonder, how do I live up to the ways in which she's described my work? She does it better than I do. So thank you for that warm welcome. We've known each other for a long time, and it's been fun to watch your career grow and flourish. And thank you all for having me here at Berkeley. It's such a special place. I walk up and down the hallways, and it's like the dream team of faculty, and then you meet the students, and it's like, this is like the best group of students around. I just think this is a really special place. And so for me, being here is a really humbling moment. I see your latest edition in the back, who you picked the right time to move from New York, my friend, into this warm weather. You all just keep getting better and better at Berkeley, so good for you. Let me just start by thanking Deborah Lustig, Martine Sanchez-Janikowski, Bailey Marcus, Joe Seal, Sacramento, for getting me here safely and on time, Patricia Baquedano Lopez, and for the units who have sponsored my trip. And a special congratulations and shout out to Professors Zeus Leonardo and Frank Woverell for their recent appointments as AERA fellows. Berkeley just keeps doing their thing, so congratulations. So let me just start by acknowledging the ancestral lands of the peoples who have been here for a long time, and recognizing my role as a visitor. My name is Brian McKinley Jones Brayboy, and I'm the son of Mary Elizabeth Jones Brayboy. She was the daughter of Rosebell McMillan Jones and Zelma Sampson Jones. She was also the daughter of McKinley Jones Sr. I'm also the son of Bobby Dean Brayboy, and he's the son of Eva Harris Brayboy and Tecumseh Bryan Brayboy II. My parents had this deal where if they had boys, my father would name them. If they had girls, my mother would name them. Of course, they had 3 boys. And my father named me after my grandfathers, Tecumseh Bryan Brayboy II and McKinley Jones Sr. I come from a small town called Prospect in North Carolina. It's a farming community. And as the screen says, I'm Lumbee. So let me just start by also introducing you to another part of who I am. This is my father and our 2 sons. That's Eli on the left, and Quanah is in the middle with my father, who recently retired from his second career as an elementary school counselor. He started at the school 63 years after he started as a student there as a counselor. So for him going back at the age of 68, he's 77 now. I finally thought 75 was time to give it up. Is a really important thing, but it's also helped center the work that I'm going to talk about today, in part because for me, these two brown kids have to live in a place like Arizona, which is a fairly tough political climate. Indeed, almost every climate in the U.S. is a fairly tough place to be a brown child these days. But in the wake of harmful legislation that criminalizes education, such as the one that Arizona proposed with House Bill 2281, or legislation that criminalizes people based on how they look, where they're driving, some of the most basic human rights, as SB Senate Bill 1070 did. It's a tough place to live, particularly when we look at these policies that the state that I live in is creating, and I think, what's going on here and what are we missing? And how do I begin to think about justice in the state? In Arizona, we've cut, since 2009, we've cut $14 million in education for our kids, all with the mindset by legislators of saying, this is to protect our children's future. Okay, and it's to protect the state's future so that we don't go further into debt. We're in the middle of a budget crisis at the moment in the state that we're trying to work through. And so what ends up happening is that oftentimes the most vulnerable people in the state end up being harmed. And so for me, I think that, and yet even as we try to talk about this, I said 14 million, it's $14 billion. There's a big difference as it turns out. As we talk about this in the state, what's become apparent to me is that people start turning to name calling right away when this happens. There are bad people on this side and there are bad people on this side. And for me, it seems to me that we've lost an ability in the state, I would argue, watching national politics, that nationally to really have debates with respect around issues and sort of just engage in this process respectfully. And it seems to be a trend around sort of being able to have civil disagreement. So I think it's important for me to be able to disagree. It's also important to be able to hear and to listen. And that means sitting down with someone with whom you don't agree, listening to what they have. It doesn't mean you have to change your mind about this, but it certainly means we have to have conversations. And in places like Arizona, we're not having those conversations, which for me is deeply troubling and problematic, because I think it's important to be able to listen to people. But I also think there's something about the mindset that's really important in all of this in terms of building a society where members can participate and excel in whatever their unique capacities are. So I've decided to talk to you today, and I'm going out, I'm stretching myself a bit today. This is not something I normally talk about and engage about. I think about my jobs at the university and my role in the president's office and some of the things I say. I may go back and not have a job when I get back as I sign the waiver for this to end up on the YouTube channel. But I also think it's important for us to talk about justice. What is this thing called justice, particularly as we lead up to AERA? And I know a number of you all have featured panels at AERA on this topic. And I want to talk specifically about how justice gets enacted and engaged in the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, but also how it gets engaged and taken up by a program that we've started at Arizona State University. And part of what I want to get at is sort of open notions of justice and closed notions of justice and how those play out. And this is really the idea that isn't quite yet formulated, but one I'm going to try to get through and hopefully have you all help me get through this. I'm not going to offer any kind of prescriptive approach toward justice, but one that really says we need to engage in agreement and disagreement with some sense of benevolence. That is, with a disposition to do good, which is not the same as being right. We seem to be arguing over being right rather than doing good. And so I'm hoping that we can sort of think differently about what it means to do good work as opposed to having to be right all the time. This work, this justice work, requires benevolence from my perspective, and it requires strength, commitment, and endurance. And so one of the points I want to leave today with is that justice is a long-term project. And we've got to engage it as such. So I'm going to just frame this in these two simple questions, which shouldn't take me all that long to get through. I'm going to pull on some data that may surprise you in a moment and sort of find myself agreeing with someone I never thought I would agree with. So here are these two questions, but let's let me engage in a bit of throat clearing with you first as we think about what these questions are. So Sandra Day O'Connor, in really what was the pivotal decision, pivotal vote in this case, the Grutter v. Bollinger case, I think suggests that that really this notion of justice is obtained through the use of somewhat of quotas and engagement, and thus the need and the nature of this work would eventually time out as we reach the goal. So if you look at this, she says it's been 25 years since we've had this in place. In 25 years from now, 2003, so that takes us to 2028, we should really be moving along in our way by her accounting. And she thinks we won't need affirmative action by then. And for me, part of what I want to suggest in terms of this quote is that increasing the number of applicants does not address the structural inequities and inequalities within institutions of higher education. And although certainly putting more of us into the institutions is great, we certainly need to do more. And so I think that in some ways, what happens in thinking about Sotomayor's case, I think we shift the conversation when, the O'Connor quote is we shift the conversation when we think about how Justice Sonia Sotomayor responds to this in some ways, but she's also responding to Roberts in the 2000 case parents in the Seattle and the Louisville cases. So part of what she says here, from my perspective, when she says, race matters because of the slights, the snickers, the silent judgments that reinforce the most crippling of thoughts. I do not belong here. And she goes on to say, and this is a direct response to Roberts, and in some ways an indirect response to O'Connor, the way to stop discrimination on the basis of race is to speak openly and candidly on the subject of race and to apply the Constitution with eyes open to the unfortunate effects of centuries of racial discrimination. We ought not to sit back and wish away rather than confront the racial inequality that exists in our society. It is this view that works harm by perpetuating the facile notion that what makes race matter is acknowledging the simple truth that race does matter. You know, Roberts has said the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race in this 2007 case. She comes back at him fairly hard in terms of this and suggesting that we can't really achieve justice because the approach is short-term, and that in some ways addressing perhaps the symptoms of a nation historically divided along staunch racial and class lines. That is, it addresses the issue of low enrollment numbers for members of minoritized communities in higher ed, but it does not eradicate the disease. So we can get at the symptoms, but we don't get at the disease. That is, until, she argues, we start talking about it and acknowledging the historical components of that. And so by not eradicating disease, it does not guarantee the long-term systemic change that we need to subvert, ameliorate, and eradicate the institutional and societal insidiousness of white supremacy, racial and social injustice. Such a change would need to be systematic, systemic, and ongoing. And I'm going to say more about that in a moment, but let me just say a few things about justice. I'm going to jump into identifying and defining justice and injustice for you in just a moment. I've said that change really needs to be systematic and systemic and ongoing, as Sotomayor points to. But let's think about what it is about justice. And I want to make 5 primary points about what this thing justice is and why we need to consider this. Some of this will may or may not be important to you. It certainly matters to me. And I think it really matters to the people who are making policies and decisions to pay attention to these 5 points. Obviously, the first one is history matters. Okay? We have to engage the false belief that things have always been the way that they have. This is part of what Gramsci's getting at in notions of hegemony, but it's also really beginning to attack an assumption that these hierarchies that are in place are naturally ordained, that they are a priori, when in fact the real story tells us something different. This becomes really important in a place like Arizona, which changed dramatically, became a state in 1848, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And so what we'll hear in Arizona a lot is people talking about and sort of presenting their bona fides as being a real Arizonan by saying that they're fifth generation Arizonan. That is, they were there on February 14th, 1912, when the state became a state, 5 generations of people. We rarely have space and time to listen and hear about people who can argue to be 100th or 120th generation Arizonan. So in this case, I sometimes think it's a little trite when people say, those people didn't cross the border crossed them. But when we think about history in this way, it becomes a really powerful point that you have people who've been located in a particular place for millennia, and all of a sudden in 1848, they're captured on one side or the other, and we think that a fifth generation really gives you bona fides when we really should be saying these people with 100th or 120th generations really should have the bona fides. And for me, that's the stuff that matters. And that's part of what I'm going to talk to you about. And as I said earlier, I'm going to draw on a few unlikely characters about where this is concerned. Let me start with Bourdieu and Passeron in 1977 on page 9. They outline this concept called Genesis amnesia, where they go on to essentially say, we've forgotten the beginning. And what is it that it finds? Genesis amnesia finds particularly its power in the naive illusion that things have always been the way they are. Well, human beings create laws and policies, right? So we can change them. And if we hear from others, it might be something for us to begin thinking about. So history matters in lots of ways. Equity and equality are not the same thing, although we tend to use them. Many of our policymakers tend to use them interchangeably. They're not, clearly. They can certainly, however, coexist with a little bit of framing with history and also thinking about the long-term nature of this. For me, equity is best framed as a project of fairness or justice. Equality is about sameness and assumes that everyone is laboring under the same function and under the same framework. It fails to take into account history and the legacy of social and racial hierarchies. We want to run and hide behind notions of equality. It's an equal country. You can do whatever you want, right? It's post-racial at this point, the arguments go, and yet to obtain justice and to attain equality, we have to implement some notions of equity, which for some people, which is fairness, which some people will argue is about unfairness or inequality. So some people have to have more in order to start from a place where you can say, okay, we're all going that way. And yet we ignore the fact that we haven't all started from the same place. And many will say to me, well, the race starts now, so good luck. So history becomes important because we don't all start from the same place, and equity and equality are clearly not the same things. Justice is a long-term project. It must be sustained and maintained over time, and we have to remain vigilant about this. It's systematic, and as I said earlier, it's enduring. What's legal and what's just are not the same things. Nazi Germany turning hoses and dogs on people in the 60s, arbitrarily stopping people in the land of their ancestors and asking them to prove that they belong and that they're illegal, cannot, in my mind, be framed as just. And yet they have been, at different points in time and continue to be now, legal. So we can't conflate what's legal and what's just. And if we're going to create a path towards justice, we can often do so from places that historically have been unjust. And part of the argument for me is about schools and schooling. Part of what I want to talk to you about today is we can actually find some justice projects in schooling and the schooling process. The Mexican American Studies program is a really good example of this. It isn't simply about, and this work isn't simply about drop-in science or drop-in knowledge. It's about a fundamental change in the structure. So if we're going to do this work, let's look at the structural components of it and move along. And you're going to hear me repeat and name these 5 ideas several times over. But for me, repeating them brings to light and acknowledging and putting them into purpose. So one of the things I've been struggling a bit about as I work through this is, and I'm not going to answer it here, but I just want to put it on the table so you know where my thinking is. What's the relationship between justice and injustice? And can we have justice without injustices? I think I've almost come to an answer on this, but I feel like in some ways we have to start pulling these things apart and looking at the relationships between them. And one of the places I'm starting to go is starting to think about the sensuality of justice. What does it taste like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? What do our senses tell us about this? And how do we connect notions of justice to intimacy? Okay? How do we begin to engage in an intimate process of thinking about justice and its relationship to injustice? Can we pull those things apart or not? So that's kind of a set aside in terms of where this work potentially goes, but it's one of the things that keeps me up at night, is what's the relationship between these two things. When we name something that is an injustice, we bring it to light, we make the invisible visible, and only in so doing can we work toward no longer stripping people of their dignity and denying their well-being. Recognizing and naming something as unjust can open pathways to reclaim and assert collective power and freedom that's been denied and subverted. So for me, injustice is the creation and perpetuation of a society that allows groups to be relegated to the worst possible futures without seriously questioning why there are consistent hierarchies. Usually this is driven and characterized by efforts to promote Genesis amnesia and maintaining the status quo. Well, it's just the way it's always been. That's the way it's going to be. Sometimes we fall into these biological notions, but we just say people would just work harder. So they're all framed often in deficit-oriented language. But creating and perpetuating a society that mainstreams and controls education so it continues to center only certain knowledges and allows the inequities to occur without question or further examination is also one of the ways that we do this. So for me, injustice is the creation, as I said, of these perpetual moves toward this. So let me just bring Ansel Dua into the conversation, and I think following her, let me just say, read her quote. As a people, we have resisted and we have taken expedient positions, but we have never been allowed to develop unencumbered. We have never been allowed to be fully ourselves. Ignorance splits people, creates prejudices. A misinformed people is a subjugated people. So following her, I think we're being killed by ignorance. And this is a connection for me to this notion of Genesis amnesia and to notions of hegemony. She knows that our self-determination is being removed, making us weak and empty. She continues by saying, we've never been allowed to develop unencumbered. We've never been allowed to be fully ourselves. This is all, for me, going to come back when we start talking about these education programs. So injustice operates under this veil of order and equality. Think about how we use this language. We want to control things, we want to order them, we want to put them in some sense of equality without really framing this historically. When we question the merit or the status quo, we begin to unravel the systematic and systemic practices that have maintained social and racial hierarchies over time. Justice is challenging for a number of reasons, but in part because we've been led to believe that this is the natural order and that everyone has the same chances. But what injustice does is it ignores and dismisses the past as history, as irrelevant to the future, even when it's apparent to others that the past and the present are intimately linked. So how do we make sense of justice and freedom and power? How do I make sense of it? What is this thing called justice? For me, it's the presence of freedom. Fundamentally, justice is about the presence of freedom. Freedom to walk, as Jessica Salyum, a recent graduate at ASU, notes, to walk unmolested in the lands of your ancestors, to travel without fear of being stopped because of what you look like, to own property, and to feel as if you have a place to belong, unfettered by policies, politics, and social processes that deny our humanity and basic dignity. Justice is about imagining and creating a society where a person and all peoples are agents of their own futures and the futures of their children. Justice is about having one's knowledge and that of their ancestors valued, acknowledged, and reproduced. It's about feeling validated, respected, and treated with dignity. Justice is, for me, is created in small victories. We only know the big victories when they come in the aggregate of these small victories. I think sometimes we make the mistake of wanting a huge victory rather than building an accumulation of this. But for me, it feels huge. It's something hard to wrap my brain and arms around. And so when I find myself getting depressed, I worry that I can't do it all. But I think about this old adage, how do we eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So how do we begin to attack tackle injustices. We do it one small victory at a time with the idea that an accumulation of these small victories helps us get to that point. It all matters. We need to pay attention to everything as far as I'm concerned. The big is often made up of the small, and ask ourselves who benefits from the status quo. Justice in my mind is cyclical, it's endemic, it's fundamentally about creating processes that address the well-being of both an individual and the groups of people to whom she or he belongs. So what's all of this mean in terms of justice work in Arizona? If y'all haven't read MLK's letter from Birmingham jail, I'm sure you have, given the people that work here, it's worth it, I promise. Justice is about the struggle, and when individuals and institutions act to address injustices, we are often told and asked to wait and to be patient, and we're met with continual acts of dehumanization. As King reminds us, freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. And from my view, this continues on. So you can see his quote here. This is really important. We have to demand this, those of us who feel like we're caught up in an unjust system, and continue to move on. So let me turn to Arizona for a moment. Lots of you all will know about what's going on here, because I know you have some ethnic studies things happening in San Francisco that lots of us are watching and admiring about the ways in which you're engaging them. For us, if we think about what's happening in Arizona at the moment, the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson has been through a ringer. I know it's just been heard in court in the Ninth Circuit to see what's going to happen with all of this. It's gotten plenty of press in other ways. Here's what I think is important about it. It has a self-determining curriculum. It's rooted in the knowledges of the people whom it seeks to serve. It engages text. It's rooted in data. There's engagement of teachers and their and students' parents, their aunties and uncles, grandmas and grandpas. These students are graduating from high school and excelling. They're going to college. They're showing up to school. They're showing up to school on time. Okay? And this is a program that was open to everyone, not just Mexican American students, by the way. And the results really cross those boundaries. So students are thriving and the teachers are thriving. The state paid $61,000 for an audit of the program to be told that the program's doing exactly what it says to do and that there's no violation of the law in it, to then have the state turn around and ignore that finding after paying $61,000 to do it, and they terminated the program. So think about this again. You have a program that has students who were disaffected from school, coming to school, excelling in school, going to college, encouraging their peers to go and show up to school and to go to college, passing tests. And so it leads me to ask the question, what's wrong with that? Really, what's wrong with that? When you have a program affecting youth who have been largely disaffected by schools, by shut out to schools, then what do we do? I actually think that I have an answer, and I'm going to draw on someone that some of you all may know, some of you won't, and it may surprise you who I think has the answers here. Glenn Beck. Do you all know Glenn Beck? You know his work? I'm going to admit publicly and on film that there are some things that Mr. Beck and I agree on. Okay. I've got 5 clips from a show that happened on April 29, 2011, in the heat of the moment as this was starting to blow up in Tucson. And we were back and forth in Tucson in council headquarters. They were putting things in the crowds were getting loud. At the end of it, they were putting something in the vent so that smoke started coming out as a way to disrupt the meetings and to push everyone out. It was crowded. People were engaged. It was hectic. And so Beck, in this conversation that I'm gonna play bits and pieces for you, is having a conversation with his producer about the program. Okay. For me, the reason I want to utilize Glenn Beck in all of this is because he's really an echo chamber of how many people were thinking about ethnic studies without any real sense of what's happening in the schools. And in the neighborhoods in which I travel in Phoenix outside of school, people are getting their news from from people like Glenn Beck. But I think there's some promise in terms of what he has to say. And as I said earlier, I agree with him, but maybe not for the same reasons he does. So here's the first quote.
Do that yet?
So help me out. This is this group of high school students, and it is. Have you seen it yet, Stu? These students are angry, and they are pounding on. They've taken over the council chambers, and they're sitting where the council sits, and they are protesting that the class is being reconsidered. It's Mexican studies or whatever, and they want to restore it. This is a class that separated people. So you would be, if you were Mexican, you'd go into that class. If you weren't, you would stay in the other. So apparently this Mexican American history class violated, according to the Tucson Unified School District, 1, the overthrow of the U.S. government. You can't teach anything that teaches that. 2, resentment towards a race being white people.
Or any race, right?
Any race. But in this case, it's white people. And the third one is you can't teach anything that's just for a particular ethnic group. Okay?
And it violates all those things.
Violates all of those things. And they want it back.
It doesn't violate all of those things, but that's really beside the point. They want it back. One might ask, why are the students angry? And Beck's tale here, and I'm going to continue to say his tale, is that the program's teaching about the overthrow of the U.S. government, resentment towards whites, and teaching for a particular ethnic group is exactly that. It's a tale. Ultimately, what Beck and others like him do with this program is to reframe and recast it as a plan for succession. Sorry, for secession. I'm from the South. I have a hard time with English. And I'm going to talk here about secession and succession and try to think about what it is. So for him, secession is about when you want to break away from things. Succession, which is what this program is about, is a plan in place for succeeding generations. So what Beck and others are doing here is saying they want to break away. They want to secede from this. And usually it's people like him that are talking about seceding. Okay? This is a plan fundamentally about succession. Think about the work of the Mexican American Studies program. It's not a plan. It never was. It never will be about secession. It's about, one, bringing up a new generation of leaders and scholars and productive people. But you see what they've done here, right? I mean, part of what Beck does is, again, make this about secession. He takes a justice-oriented project and recasts it as an unjust one. That's fundamentally a wrong proposition, to take something that's rooted in engagement and a succession plan, recasting it as secession, and then dismissing it completely. But it gets better. He continues later on in this conversation.
But look at this video. You'll see this at 5 o'clock. We're doing a whole hour on how much is enough. I mean, what's happening in our schools. Look what's happening in our schools and look what they're doing.
Does appear to be Mexican-American students.
Mexican-American students. And if you look at these kids, they're chanting. This is Che stuff. This is all Che stuff. And look at these. When they are behind, you go 1 minute into this report, and you see the kids that have taken over the council chamber, and they are completely out of control. Completely out of control.
Yeah, they look like wild animals in there. I mean, what is the deal here? Are we not in the United States of America? Why would you want the overthrow of the U.S. government taught in our schools?
Indeed, what is going on? So in the next couple of clips, Glenn Beck's going to say that what he wants to do is connect with youth, and he admits that he doesn't know how. And I believe him. Okay? Perhaps we should be asking, what's so special about this program that students would be angry enough to demonstrate, to be angry enough to organize and to take over council chambers? I've got a teenager and a tween in my house, and for me, getting them off the couch to do anything is a significant challenge. They get angry when I take away their Xbox. They get angry when I say you can't be on the phone later, when I take away their internet access. He's angry if he has to go to school. He's not angry when there are vacation days. He's not angry when they cancel a class, unless it's his PE class. So what's going on? If that's in fact true of lots of students, and students who have been going to school or not going to school, I'd argue that the students themselves are asking that question in response to the termination. They're asking what's going on here, in the same ways that Beck's asking it. That is, they're asking how much is enough. So here's what Beck and his producer are doing in all of this. They call for order and equality. Remember, that's how injustice masks itself, in order and equality. They are out of control, he says, his producer says. They're acting like wild animals. So this call for order is about really saying, let's just keep things the way they are, so that it's equal for everyone. That maintains the status quo. It perpetuates entrenchment in inequalities, and it fails to challenge notions of privilege. It certainly won't create a pathway towards justice. And they continue to these calls throughout this clip and other clips that I've seen for Beck and others talking about why Mexican American studies and ethnic studies are bad things. Because it's out of order. Because it doesn't maintain the status quo. And by referring to students as wild animals, they work effectively to dehumanize these young people. Pathologizing and criminalizing a people's struggle from oppression serves the interest of maintaining the status quo and upholding white supremacy. It is, from my perspective, a colonial tool that serves to dehumanize them, deny their history, strip away their dignity, their strength, commitment, and endurance. Why, again, I would ask, are we celebrating the work of these why aren't we celebrating the work of these young people and their mentors for engaging in this courageous work and demanding their rights? It isn't, after all, unlike the notion of don't tread on me, that patriots like Beck and others celebrate. So throwing a bunch of tea in a harbor is okay, but it's not okay to go into council chambers in Tucson Unified School District and ask for one's rights. For me, in the next clip, Beck really begins to get at some fundamental truths that I don't know that he's naming in the same ways that I'm naming, but there's some truth in what he has to say here. See if I can find it. Sorry.
Are losing our country because we have lost our children. We have got to grab a hold of our children. You know, it has been such a strong prompting of mine to make sure that I leave Fox and I go and I try to target with information the youth of America. And quite honestly, I don't know how to do it. I really don't. We are making it up as we go along, but I am moving in that direction. But boy, are we going to need your help.
Because we're way behind.
We are so far behind.
In the meeting this morning, you were talking about targeting our children, and what a great job they're doing on primetime TV with that. I mean,
we're going to address this tonight.
They've totally taken over.
Yeah, I mean it's so far out of our values. Mainstream television, so far out of our values, and yet we watch it with our children and we expect that, oh, they know better, it's just a TV show. No, they don't. No, they don't. I mean, it's incredible to me. How many more signs do you need? How many more things do your friends and neighbors need? Look, it is important for you to get involved, and it is important for you to unite with one another.
It's also incredible to me how many more signs we need. There's a difference in values being played out here. Beck's making an axiological clash. He says so. It's so far out of our values. And he encourages us to grab hold of our children, and I agree, but probably for very different reasons. Mexican American studies allowed us to do that, to present our youth with the work of writers who understood their experiences, named their struggles, and expressed possibilities for their future. That's what it takes to reach young people. Unwittingly, Beck fails to recognize that most social movements are actually driven by youth. There's a power to encourage and a willingness to stand up for change that they exhibit. And if he needs help with figuring out how to connect with youth, I think the teachers and the administrators in the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson could certainly help him figure out how to do it. Because given what he's doing now isn't really going to help him do that. Okay? It'd be a good place to start. So 2 more quick clips. And they really are quick.
It is important for you to get involved, and it is important for you to unite with one another. Community organizing is what this is all about, and they have taken it.
Community organizing is what it's all about. Okay. That's exactly what Mexican American Studies does in Tucson. It organizes community. It engages community. It brings parents and teachers and administrators and curricula together, all for the benefit of children. And the same people who are arguing against the president who has a background in community organizing are now calling for it as a strategy to try to put people back in the places in which they belong. Here's this last quote, and the one that is probably my favorite.
We have got to have love and courage in our hearts, and we've got to teach the truth to our children and make it a priority.
We do. We do. We do. We have to have love and courage in our hearts, and we have to tell the truth. This is why history matters. This is why Genesis amnesia is such an important part of this, for truth-telling, not for telling tales, but for telling the truth. It's why the curriculum in the Mexican American Studies program is so important, because it tells a different kind of truth than is being told in other kinds of schools. Are you all watching what's happening with AP history tests? About why we're not allowed to take that? Because it doesn't frame slavery in a positive light? Seriously? We want to tell the truth, and we want to have courage. What we're seeing now is really a moment of courage that says, let's shut down conversation. Let's censor having these conversations. Let's censor people being able to push back on this. Now we're supposed to be talking about American exceptionalism and how great the U.S. is. Okay. The people I love the most, I love because I know all of them. The good, the bad, the ugly. It's not that I only know one side of exceptional, of who they are in terms of exceptional. That's what first dates are for. It's for what getting to know your friends are for. It's not how you build deep and abiding relationships. And it's not what really this country is about. So when Beck says we need to have love and courage and to tell the truth, I agree with him. And he asks this question, what's happening in our schools? We are, in fact, losing our country, as he argues. Okay. In part because kids don't want to be in school. This is exactly what the Mexican American program does in Tucson. And so framing it somehow as extreme, I find puzzling. Okay. Given its nonviolent approach, given the fact that it adheres to First Amendment rights, all the constitutional people love that, utilizing school as a pathway towards success and growth and engagement with larger society. This is really fundamentally about a protest about whose knowledge counts, whose knowledge is important, whose curricula matters, and that we should count on. So it's an epistemological clash, but it's also an axiological clash in the value part of this. What knowledges are we going to value? What are we going to suggest is good, true, right, and beautiful in all of this? And for people like Beck and the people that listen to him and watch him, they have their own sets of truths and beauty. And yet we see what happens with the Mexican American Studies program. They have their own sets of truths and beauties. So we should be asking ourselves whose stories matter and whose knowledge counts. Fundamentally, this is what this program does, interestingly, is engage the American dream. It says to young people, work hard, show up, do well in school, buy property, vote, be good members of society. But here's where it falls down. It fundamentally challenges the status quo about what those people are supposed to do, which is to not show up, which is in their minds to not work hard, which is to not vote, which is to not buy property, and to be disallowed from the engagement in society as citizens. That's what those communities are supposed to do. And Mexican American Studies disrupts the perceived structure of things, the belief that things have always been the way they are. So all of a sudden you have young people earning scholarships to colleges, all of a sudden becoming valedictorians. Well, that's not the way it's supposed to be, right? And so, interestingly, there's a pushback, and paradoxically, in a time when teachers are being beaten over the heads for not being engaged in their communities, and for not engaging their children, and for not doing place-based work, you have these teachers who are doing all of these things coming increasingly under attack. So part of what I would argue is that this is really a closed approach to justice. Okay, you want to close off possibilities. And in the folks who founded Mexican American Studies, who administer it, who teach in it, have a really open view of about what this is supposed to look like. But the response is one that's closed by the institution, larger society, okay, and importantly by the state legislature in Arizona. So they close off any possibilities for growth. Let me just pivot a bit here to a program that we have at ASU that I think is a little bit different than this and is engaging in what I think is an open kind of engagement with justice. This is the Pueblo doctoral cohort. This picture was taken in 2012, fall of 2012. All of these people, except for one, have gone through a doctoral program, and they're all graduating with PhDs in May of 2015. Okay. It's a program in some ways we stole from a place called UC Berkeley that you all did with Pueblos a number of years ago. The Leadership Institute at the Santa Fe Indian School came to us in the fall of 2011, and they said, will you build a doctoral program for us? We think we can get money. There are 19 Pueblos in the state of New Mexico. We have leaders in them who need the skills and kinds of credentials that you can help us give in the School of Social Transformation. We need some help. All of these people are leaders. They all need help in terms of getting through this. Will you do this? So they came to us in the fall of 11. We took it to our director, our dean, our provost, our president, and they all said, yeah, we can do that. Go ahead and build it. So we started talking with the Leadership Institute. We went to the Kellogg Foundation. We asked for some dough, and they backed up a Brinks truck and dumped it out on the table, and they said, here you go. Do your work. By the spring of 2012, the program was up and going. Students had been admitted. In the fall of 2012, the students started taking classes. Okay. The gentleman on the far left is a two-time governor in the village of Laguna. Laguna does $250 million a year business. The woman in front of him just successfully argued a Supreme Court case in New Mexico. And the list goes on and on and on about what these folks are doing. Here's what we do. Every week I get on an airplane to go to Albuquerque to rent a car and drive north to Santa Fe to teach classes. Part of what we did is understand the importance of place and to take education to the Pueblos of New Mexico. Rather than pulling leaders from those places where they are engaging in the good work of challenging the status quo and creating new kinds of futures and possibilities, we said, well, we're going to try to think about this differently. So it's forcing us to rethink the role of the doctorate in the work that we do at ASU. Okay. The students are pressing us. We have to do more. We have to connect internationally. They've been to Norway. They've been to Canada. They're going to New Zealand soon. They've got these international connections that they're making up. The governor, the guy on the left, is creating a wine business, and he's got a partner in New Zealand. They're building this huge international conglomerate of wine growers and makers. Okay? So they're thinking outside the box, and for them, justice is fundamentally about disrupting the status quo and fundamentally about freedoms. Freedoms to be who you are in particular places. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to say a whole bunch more about this, but what I think is really important about this is that these students are finishing this May writing dissertations, and part of the dissertation is to write a policy brief for the communities from which they come that addresses a particular challenge that that community is facing. They have to present them publicly, and they have to say, here are my recommendations based on the research I've been doing for the past 3 years. The communities, by the way, said, here's a problem that we want you to think about and help us think through. And so it also fundamentally for us changes the role of the doctorate in terms of what are we supposed to do with it. And in this case, justice is really about saying, let's try to figure this out. For me, one of the mistakes we often make is when we think about justice is to think about it as a zero-sum game. That's what's happening in Mexican-American studies. People's responses to it are, there's only enough places at the front of the line. These people's places at the back of the line. This is a much more expansive view of justice that says, we can all do really good things. Whether you're building a wine conglomerate, or whether or not you're creating a new form of school, or you've got a nonprofit that focuses on feminist ideologies around violence against women, and creating programs about that in sexual health. And so an open sense of justice does exactly that. It rejects zero-sum games, and it begins to push against that and to say, let's open this up so that there's more. So let me just do a couple of quick closing thoughts with the idea that I've had more to say than I clearly wanted to, and I'm about to get yanked off by some cane. We have to step up and fight these attacks on programs like the Mexican-American Studies one, and to begin to look at what the data are telling us. Nolan Cabrera and Jeffrey Milam and others have written about this really, really cogently and powerfully in the American Educational Research Journal. But we need to do this. We need to fight against the characterization about some sense of this program somehow being inferior when we know that it's actually superior in terms of what it does. There's a need here to expand how we understand whose knowledges count and to have those kinds of conversations. And we need to ask ourselves, how can programs like this that fundamentally change the way these young people engage with schooling and the schooling process be bad? And how can we step up and begin to push back against those and say, we need to do better? Justice is, for me, structural and systemic freedom. It decenters the individual and centers healthy, functional relationships by the ways in which people's, places, futures, and their well-beings all become centered. This is about freedom for all, as opposed to freedom for a few. Freedom to walk in the world, to do things, as opposed to freedom from having things. And having things done to us or to them because of a membership in a particular kind of group. Freedom is about busting up status quo and challenging that. And it's about individual agency, but also a collective need for self-determination, and disrupts notions of victims and victimry. So these programs, the one program is critiqued for doing all of those things, right? As opposed to a program that we have the privilege of operating in a place like ASU that isn't under the same kind of financial constraints as barriers as the university, as the school district to be able to do their work. Okay. So an open view says, yes, we'll step up and do this. A closed view says, not so fast. Justice for me is a perpetual project. It's also about the structural and systemic freedoms, which I've just suggested that we should be doing in terms of this work. And one response to TAILS is to spin a different kind of thing that's rooted in data. There's a move here from scarcity, that is, there are only limited spots for people to be able to participate in democracy and units in larger society, to one of self-determination. And it forces us to rethink the status quo. There's a fundamental question about what Mexican-American Studies does in terms of centering community knowledges and the people and the places in which they work that goes unrecognized. And so for me, fundamentally what justice does is it moves us from a zero-sum game and some sense of scarcity to one of endless possibilities of humans to alter and engage the challenges in front of them. I've said all of this already, but again, I want to focus on the fact that we engage and embody justice. It's sensory. and thinking about the sensuality of justice is a really important piece that I think I'm beginning to think about moving toward and thinking this through. Let me end here by saying none of this work happens by itself. I've got a really nice research group. These are 3 of the members of my research team. Jessica's on the left, Jessica Sawyam, who just defended her dissertation. She's done now. Jeremiah on the right is 6'7". He's the starting power forward on the law team. He's a joint JD PhD. I recruited him to the University of Utah when he was 17 years old. He's the guy that is, I think, going to help drive some of these conversations. And in the middle is baby Nicholas, who's just starting the JD PhD program at ASU. So it's these guys, this woman, who have helped me work through this, and I want to make sure that I acknowledge them. So thank you all. Although we could all do with some more MJ.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for so much. The weekend we need to process together. Thank you very much. And now we can take questions from the floor. Please.
You want me to move?
Close to the mic?
Yeah.
Yes.
Patricia, maybe turn off the projector, making it all blue.
The projector. One thing we can do is turn the slide off. Does that help? No, that's not gonna help. No. Let me go behind
Back
you.
to the projector.
Just don't touch anything.
There we go.
We did it. All right, so we can take questions, and Deb back there has a microphone.
Well, I have a question since no one else is asking one right now. Could you fill us in on what's happening with Mexican American Studies and student activism and
They're back at it. There's a revised curriculum that a number of people worked on. Sorry, I'm being held in. I'm off my mark, apparently. They're back at it. There's been reconstituted with a new curriculum that's going. The case has been heard now in the Ninth Circuit in terms of what's going on there. It looks like it's got some legs and certainly some support. In Arizona, we've just elected a superintendent of education who largely ran by ducking debates with a guy named David Garcia. Some of you all know David's work. He's an educational policy guy who was the candidate running against her. So she ducked debates, and her campaign signs were bright red, and they said Diane Douglas, and above it it said conservative. That's what she ran on. There's a recall effort was actually started before the election, so in 6 months there will be some sort of vote. I suspect their signatures are already in place for that. She's got her eyes on that. The legislature has their eyes on that. They're largely rooted in sort of Tea Party-like ideologies, so I don't know where all of this is going to go, but they're doing their work. I think that the new curriculum is a decent, really strong curriculum and demonstrates for me the power of the people's engagement in all of this. So I don't know what's going to happen with it, but the initial signs look like we'll see what the federal court does with it and whether or not the state's willing to listen to the federal court. I mean, we've sort of, the state's ignored that in the past, and so we'll likely do that again. The students have stepped up and been unbelievably strong. Attendance is high. They're continuing to go to college and achieve at really remarkable levels in terms of the structures that have been put in front of them. So we'll see. I mean, lots of us are looking in San Francisco to see what's happening here with ethnic studies, to see what we can learn from doing that work.
Hey, Brian, thank you.
Hi.
I'm one of those Arizonans, I don't know what to call myself now since you can't use some of those terms. Since you were emphasizing history, the Mexican American Studies movement has deep roots of long-time activism in Arizona, particularly in the mining towns that have long histories of pushback. And I wonder, in these programs that are being developed, how much of that history is also grounded in the way we think, so we don't look at the Mexican American Studies program as an isolated or new phenomenon,
Yeah.
but one that's really embedded in a long history of struggle.
Yeah. The high school program is certainly doing that in terms of looking at what's happened historically. We're creating another program at ASU that models this Pueblo doctoral cohort that's aimed at Mexican American students in Phoenix, and really framing it as a project around indigeneity and what it means to have been in a place for 150 generations, and sort of forcing a rethinking of that. And Nicholas, baby Nick, who you all saw in the middle, it was his master's applied project, was to try to create this program. And we've taken it up at ASU and are in the process of finding funding for it and enacting it that really starts in that place. So that, and I think it is important to understand that there are lots of people who have been engaged in this work for an awful long time at significant personal cost to themselves. And I think that what's been interesting for me in talking with young people in Tucson and elsewhere about that work, one of the important pieces of history that we probably don't talk about enough is framing it in that way for them gives them a real sense of responsibility to carry on and to honor the memories of the people who have done that work. Certainly your family is a good example of people who have been engaged in this work for several generations and beyond that. So we're working it through. It's been interesting, but not surprising, the resistance to telling those kinds of stories, because they're not supposed to be told, and we're not supposed to pay attention to the fact that literally there have been people in these places that we somehow frame as foreign who've been there for several millennia. So it's an interesting conversation for us to have, and I think it's also been interesting to think about how people engage and or listen and disagree with us. I mean, the opening admonition for me is to really, how do we engage in these difficult dialogues and have these conversations? And I find that the most frustrating part of the work that we're trying to do around justice, which is to just sit down and have conversations, even if we don't agree, and listen with some respect and listen with some benevolence and say, okay, we may walk away with this and not agree on this, but let's at least have a conversation and engage the humanity in one another. And I think the history helps us do some of that, although people really want to quickly erase it and brush it aside, right?
Hey, Brett. How are you doing?
Michael, I'm doing well. How about you?
Good. It's good to see you. So I want to kind of maybe follow up on that a moment to kind of think about this notion of speaking to one another, and in relation to your notion of justice and this focus on the little things. And one of the things you said is that you're focusing on little things, more incremental, maybe gradualist kinds of things that might lead up to justice. And maybe you want to kind of talk a little bit more about that. But you also then had the King quote, which is that freedom is never given by the oppressors. But I was thinking little things are given by the oppressors. And those little things, on the one hand, we want to conceptualize those as justice. But if the oppressors are giving those things, and King said, well, those aren't really justice, what are they doing with those little things? So I think even as you think about this program, what kind of things are being, what kind of conceptualizations of Mexican American studies are palatable? And if we say, well, at least that's a little victory, we're having a conversation and they're willing to acknowledge this, is that even actually justice? Or could those little things actually keep us from having justice by being the illusion of justice?
Yeah.
And so, I'm just, how do you negotiate that?
I think it's a great question, and it gets at the real struggle with some of this work. And so I think initially the response was, there are no little things that are okay about this. And it took going to court to really have that happen, and then reconceptualize a curriculum that included people like Danny Solorzano and others writing a curriculum that lots of us thought was a really good, strong curriculum that would allow to do that, but it took a court intervention to have that happen. So for me, that's an example of one of these little pieces of justice that I think will matter. And I agree with you, the point that King makes in the longer longer piece is really implicating progressives, right, for not doing enough. And I think we can actually see some of that playing out in places like Arizona. The progressives in Arizona aren't doing enough. The radicals are pushing some of this. The conservatives are sitting aside and sort of pulling back resources on all of this. So I think it's taken some court intervention to try to do this. It's taking a toll on the leaders who are doing the work. For me, the little victories end up in places like, and they're not so little, but I'm sort of a believer that in the cumulative effects of what it means for these little victories, getting more people from Mexican American studies into college, to get them trained as teachers to be able to go back and do that work, to bring them into doctoral masters and doctoral programs to begin changing the conversations at the university. And so on the surface, those things seem like little things, but really the underlying motive behind them is the bigger piece about demanding some sense of justice. So I think that's the way I'm trying to work myself out of this. But what's interesting for me is, and I get this, there is not much patience in these communities for us to be eating the elephant one bite at a time, right? And so it's been an interesting engagement to have people say, you have to do more and you have to do it faster, which I totally get. At the same time, we're working in a system that is closed and not as open as it should be. So we'll see how this plays itself out. But I think the more students we get out into colleges, out engaging in the community work that they've been engaged in, with a full understanding about what the costs are associated with that work. So we're starting to have these conversations as young people go out and engage in this work. What will this mean for you later in life? How are we supporting you in terms of doing that work? So even the demands of the change, I think, are also vitally important, and what are the consequences of doing that work? So I'd like to talk to you more about ways for us to think about how to work this through. But it's clearly a flaw in the thinking in terms of how we're doing the work.
I also wanted to acknowledge the Ohlone Nation, whose land we're on right now. And I wanted to thank you for being here on Ohlone territory and presenting today. One interesting point that I wanted that was part of your presentation was alluding to the fact that a lot of students of color are not dropping out, but they're actually getting pushed out of the system, and that these ethnic studies programs are inspiring youth to be excited about education and making them do something so radical like occupy the school board offices and chain themselves. And I also was there in Tucson. I was part of the Tucson Unified School District Native American Studies program, and I got to interact a lot with Mexican American Studies students and was very impressed with how knowledgeable they were, and felt that they were on par with a lot of undergraduate students with their terms of theory and education and background. And I think that a lot of the threat that I think Glenn Beck and the echo chamber that he was representing there was a threat to a growing awareness in Chicano people and people from the Meso and Caribbean and South America that are starting to acknowledge and understand their indigeneity to the hemisphere, and starting to recognize that they too are Native Americans, and Native Americans are not created by treaties with colonizers, but we have been here from time immemorial. So I was hoping that maybe you could talk more about white supremacy in education and their attempts to continue the assimilation process and to want to continue pushing out students rather than getting them inspired and having ownership of their education and of their communities and their education programs.
If what I've said hasn't made me lose my job yet, that question will help me get there. In terms of talking about white supremacy, I think that, it's interesting for me. There's a guy named Scott Lyons who's a rhetoric and composition scholar who does really interesting work around this concept called rhetorical sovereignty, which is really responding to what he calls rhetorical imperialism. And rhetorical imperialism is really how larger society controls the terms of the debate. And I think that that's what's happening in these instances. If we think about notions of white supremacy, it's really about who controls the terms of the debate and who determines who's a native person, who isn't, who determines what kinds of histories come to the fore, what don't. And so that's a big piece of that. It's also a big piece of what kinds of knowledges it seems to me count. So for me, what Mexican American Studies is doing, I think part of what our Pueblo doctoral cohort is doing is really responding with some sense of rhetorical sovereignty in opposition to this rhetorical imperialism by reframing the terms of the debate. And I think we just have to keep asking the question, why is it a bad thing that these kids are showing up to school and engaged in the process of learning, and continue to demonstrate and point out the fact that there's this need for control in terms of what success looks like. A need to control who counts as indigenous or who doesn't. And we continue to talk about 565 federally recognized tribes, and on and on and on, which gets at the notion of the legal and political implications of that, but fails to recognize the legal and political implications of people being dispossessed of that kind of status by these larger kinds of policies. So we certainly see that playing itself out in these conversations, whether it's Mexican American Studies. KRS has just been, they've just said don't come back to Tucson because you're using his music in the work there. And so we're starting to actually see it begin to pick up and proliferate in terms of how white supremacy is sort of grasping at saying we're not going to do this. And for me, we look at the demographics of the state of Arizona. There's no majority anymore. 42% Latino, 42% white, and then other groups comprise the other 16%. This feels a little bit as a bit of a desperation to sort of hold on to those last remnants of that by determining who gets to vote, who gets to go to school, whose knowledges count, who gets to be successful in schools, who gets into college. And for me, that's very much rooted in notions of white supremacy, I think. So we'll see what happens in 10 years. I'm fairly hopeful about it. My colleagues that I work closely with say it's just going to get worse before it gets better. So I don't know where that's going to go. We'll see.
Oh, you okay. Sorry.
Just checking in real quick. I would like to know more about. I got my notes here and I'm looking. Because I reframed it, but I think you're talking about the body of justice, right? The sensuality of justice, the soma of justice. And I want to know what that looks like in this framework you're working. Is this it's a place, I think it is a place of epistemology. It's a place, it's a knowledge located on the body. Perhaps it is knowledge that is, in terms of justice, a place of knowing pain, a desire to stop pain, a desire to inflict pain, and that this is, as I understand, this search for this unpacking of what I understand to be the sensuality of justice and of seeking justice. Do you have thoughts on that? I know you're beginning this framework, and so just wanted to know more about that.
Well, we're working through it. Jesse and I, in particular, are starting to spend some time thinking about notions of sensuality and how that relates to justice and how it's embodied. And for me, the pain is really the infliction of injustices. So we're trying to think about what are the pleasure points where do we find pleasure in the sensuality of what justice looks like? And for me, I'm at a place now where I feel like we can have justice without having injustices, actually. And I think we find that a lot, for example, in our creation stories. Our creation stories create some sense of justice for us and outline it long before Native peoples encountered these senses of injustices. I think that's true for lots of folks who have different kinds of origin stories about what the world can be and might be. I think that the scars for me, are important. The pain of injustices are important as well as reminders, but it's not a place I particularly want to dwell. I'm trying to think about how do we find pleasure spaces in this? How do we find, it's interesting because in working with Jessie, she had some medical issues and she lost taste for a while. And when she was in the office with the research team and people were eating lunch, she'd say, "Describe what your food tastes like for me." And so we all got pretty decent at describing the texture of the food, the taste, the way in which it crunched or didn't crunch in our mouths and feel going down and all of those things. And part of it was her just trying to derive some pleasure from our eating because she wasn't able to taste much. And we started thinking about that as it relates to notions of justice. So how do we begin to describe what is the texture of it, what it tastes like, what it smells like? And I don't know that we're entirely there yet, but there are these moments where we have these small victories where it's like, oh, that's a whiff of what it's going to be like, whether it's someone going to school, whether it's someone resigning from a job, someone getting a job someplace else, someone retiring. It feels like that helps us. That's a little bit of spice to help move that along, but also watching people do their thing at the institution or people do their thing in larger society. So we're still trying to work through what that is. Even talking about the sensuality of it, people are like, why are you sexualizing this? Well, sensuality isn't about sexualization of anything. It's really about our engagement around the senses with this and the embodiment of that. And so the young people in this work who took over the chambers, who came in and took over the state legislature, embody senses of justice in response to the injustices, but you can also see them embodying it in terms of the work that the press isn't covering, in terms of the great work that they're doing at home around voting, the great work they're doing in terms of working with their elders, the great work in terms of cultivating gardens in the ways in which their ancestors did. So all the positive parts of that and the embodiment of it is also one of the things we're thinking about. So I can imagine growing your own food in traditional ways is one of the ways in which we begin to taste justice. Right? Even though we're tasting carrots that taste like other kinds of carrots, there's a different flavor in them, and we've planted them ourselves in these ways in which our ancestors did, under our own rules and guidelines, where we're setting the terms of how do we plant this, when do we pull them out, what kinds of knowledges do I engage that with. So I think that's one of the places we're starting to try to move towards and thinking this through. I'm sorry, it's so undeveloped.
Thank you, Brian. Many things were interesting. I'm going to point to a particular one about your comments that something is legal doesn't mean that it's just. And I think we just need a simple answer, simple example of, slavery was legal, right? And the findings in the court cases involving Michael Brown suggest that what the police did was legal, yet a lot of people are saying it's unjust. But at the same time, marginalized people have relied on the courts, legality, for example, or legal statutes to get themselves a piece of justice. And in the case of the schools in Arizona, the fight broke out when they were deemed illegal, which included not being able to convene, which struck a blow at their legitimacy. So the other things are connected to the law. So I'm interested in your understanding precisely of the relationship between legality and justice, to the extent that, okay, we can assume that just because it's legal doesn't mean it's just, and therefore just because it's illegal doesn't mean it's unjust. But people of color have relied on the Supreme Court cases to get some justice. So what's the relationship to you about law and justice?
typical Professor Leonardo question, one that I can't answer, which I totally appreciate and love you for. I think that it's the fundamental challenge for those of us who think about ourselves as progressive moving forward, whether it's about Mexican American studies or about affirmative action or whatever, is an over-reliance on legal relief in terms of doing this. So when O'Connor says you've got to 2028, it puts a bookend on where that legality is, which is in some ways why Sotomayor's response to it in some ways is so important, and yet given the climate, we don't know where the court's going to go. So I think in some ways what the right has done is a really ingenious thing by re-invoking and sort of recasting and reclaiming what equality looks like, and taking out the intent and the history of it in terms of what it was supposed to do. So I think part of what the argument here is figuring out where we think about legality, what's legal and what's just, is really starting to think about how do we begin to get at notions of intent, which is actually it is an important legal concept, which is how do we think about notions of intent and how do we begin to get at and demonstrate that. Some of this is about how we introduce social science work into legal proceedings, which Jeremiah, the big guy, is working on in his work. But I don't know that I have an answer yet about, we've painted ourselves in. I mean, the relief comes from the courts in terms of that. And so I think that at some point what's going to happen is for there to be an uneasy sense with the fact that what's legal and what's just aren't the same things, and decide how much we're going to split our time between those things. For me, the question really should be about justice, at the same time that we know that if we don't have some sort of legal constructs in place in terms of who's controlling the terms of the debate, we're kind of stuck. So this is another one of those places. I think Michael pointed out one of the places I'm sort of painted into a corner by thinking and relying on notions of demanding freedom, even in small increments, and then this sense about how do we begin to disentangle what's legal and what's just. But I'm certainly interested in hearing your own thoughts on this. You've probably already worked it through. There's a chapter coming out already about it.
I mean, we both read some of the same literature. I mean, we both know CRT came out of legal studies, and I don't think many of them believe law is going to get us out of this problem. And so it was just really a sincere question about how do we use the law to get a little bit of justice, even when that doesn't equate with.
Yeah.
Hi. My question is, why do you think the Mexican American program was the main targeted program, given the fact that HB 2281, it's framed as targeting all ethnic studies?
Two words, Tom Horn, who is no longer our Attorney General, but at the time was a superintendent of education who had, part of what we've done is we've gone down and we started pulling his papers using Freedom of Information Act and letters that he's writing back and forth with constituents in Tucson. And it's pretty clear based on those letters that Horn, who at the time was superintendent and later became Attorney General, was really focused on some individual constituents' discomfort with the fact that the graduates from this program were taking spots at the university, taking scholarships that their children were entitled to. And so I think that in part, it's really Horn who pushes this, even in the midst of this happening in 2009 when Huppenthal, Superintendent Huppenthal takes over. It's really Tom Horn, that sort of started all of this going, in part because it's uneasy relationship with Latino community in Arizona. And I think that what we're starting to see now is, while it started with Mexican American studies, they're going after African American studies in Tucson now. It's been the primary target now that this is tied up in court. They're starting to focus on that. So it was broad enough and omnibus enough that I think that it's just a matter of time. Interestingly, HB 2281 takes American Indians out of the picture and recognizes notions of sovereignty in that. But there was a conversation yesterday with a new superintendent about this that for many of us, I wasn't there, actually Jesse and Nicholas were there, representing the center have some concerns about how she's thinking about this, because one of her goals, stated goals, is to get rid of all ethnic studies programs and to enforce it in its full capacity. So we'll see, but I think Horn, if you just look at Horn, and stay tuned, because we published a law review journal article on the initial parts of some of those letters, but we're going through and starting to analyze some of his correspondence back and forth with this, and it's a pretty simple thing about him. My own perspective is just sort of him deciding who belongs and who doesn't, in really frightening ways, to be perfectly honest with you.
We must take a pause and continue and pick up this conversation in the near future. So we want to thank you, Brian Brayboy, for an amazing talk. You left us much to think about, and we hope to see you very soon again on our campus. Thank you, everyone.